Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode of SCV CHAT. I'm your host for the evening, Moose. We were originally, if you know, going to do this Monday, but of course, everybody was sick or busy. And the funny thing is poor GCB is still sick, and everybody else is Matt's still moving and all that. So we're going to be getting in the book very soon. But first, it is Robert E. Lee's birthday, so let's all give a big happy birthday to General Robert E. Lee. Before we get started, please remember the views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are not necessarily the views and opinions of the SCV, its GEC, nor any division, brigade, camps, or any other subsidiaries. So I'm so happy y'all could join us. We're starting a bit later, so I'm going to buy a bit of time for everybody to get in. We're starting at 7:30. So I couldn't even do the normal catchphrase of, you know what time it is on a Monday afternoon. But usually we do the reruns on Wednesday. So I'm hoping that we get a good little crowd here and we can celebrate Robert E. Lee's birthday. We have the legend Paul Grambling Jr. in the chat, past commander-in-chief. And then we have our historian-chief, Mr. Todd Owens, saying the moose is loose. That I am. They're letting me talk a lot this week. I'm pretty sure Connor is very sick because he has to be very scared to be making me the host of the majority, if not of all of SCV Chat's programming this week. Jesse just said he got a new armed security job. Congrats, Jesse. But yes, it's good to see everybody on this very special day. Again, we're going to buy a bit of time before we get into our program for this evening. Please remember, tomorrow, Look Around the Confederation, we'll be talking about Lee Jackson Day, giving it the media coverage it deserves instead of the media coverage it got. And so if you have any Lee Jackson Day, how you celebrated, if you were in Virginia, no matter what, send it in to scvyouthOutreach@gmail.com, and it'll be featured on the upcoming episode of Look Around the Confederation. We also have the camp in Virginia putting up the new Robert E. Lee monument, modeled after the one taken down, coming on to talk about the progress they've made. And, of course, any other questions y'all have, so be coming up with them. We have Cousin Vinny in the chat. We have Miss Joy in the chat. With that, I think we have Mr. Dennis Brown in the chat. Look at you, sir. Let me put Adam's comment up. Happy 215th birthday to General Lee. Yes, it's a good day. It's a good day. This is basically Robert E. Lee week on SCV Chat. We'll be talking about General Lee the whole week here on SCV Chat. So hopefully you guys have been enjoying it so far. And tomorrow we'll wrap it up with Lee Jackson Day news coverage and talking about a Lee monument, hopefully going up in the near future. Let's see here. All right, we got about a good crowd, so I guess we can get to tonight's program. We're going to be going over Lee the last years, and I have a very special guest on to help me do that. I'm extremely blessed he offered his services to come on Monday so we could have a good show here today. Me and him have both read the book. We might be a little bit rusty, but we have a great show for y'all planned. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome tonight's guest, Mr. Michael C. Hardy.
Good evening, sir. Happy birthday, General Lee.
Happy birthday indeed. As Jason said, basically January needs to be just, at this point, Lee Jackson month instead of just giving them a day. I celebrated, and I got people telling me they celebrate Lee Jackson Day from Friday till Sunday. Then, of course, Monday is Robert E. Lee Day in Mississippi, anyway. And then today, of course, is Robert E. Lee's birthday. Then soon it'll be General Jackson's birthday.
That's right.
So at this point, let's just make it Lee Jackson month and celebrate these great heroes the whole month.
Well, some folks say that April is Confederate History Month.
Mm-hmm.
It's always Confederate History Month at my house.
Hey, so, amen. I like to hear that.
Whether it be Lee or Jackson or Forrest or maybe some general you've never heard of, it's always Confederate History Month around here.
Love to hear that. Love to hear it. And I think in Texas, it's actually called Confederate Heroes Day.
Yeah, I saw a friend who runs a museum in Texas post that today, that his museum was celebrating Confederate Heroes Day in Texas. So we need to have more of that too.
Oh, yes, sir. I guess a broader term. I like it because, just these are our heroes. They're our Confederate heroes. So I'm a firm believer that, all our Confederate ancestors need to be honored. And I feel like some people do exclude a lot of people sometimes in this broad term. Because we had so many great names, you automatically focus on them. But of course, when you're honoring these men, I also believe you're honoring all the people that served under them. But, again, everybody deserves love and everybody deserves a focus. And luckily with SCV Chat, I've got to learn a lot more about, I hate to say it because it exposes how much I focused on the big names in my youth. I guess I am still young. Don't feel it after yesterday. I helped one of my friends move. I'm sore and I feel like I'm much older than 22.
Hey, I was shoveling snow yesterday.
I get called and they're like, we're just moving a thing or two. And I mean,
it's not that I had to shovel snow yesterday. It's because there's no place to go. But it was there and I needed out of the house and it was somewhat warm. And so, yeah, I'm not as young as I once was either. So.
It's a running joke because I am the oldest usually in my friends group that I act like the old man of the group because with me playing basketball, I hurt my knee at a very young age and never really got it looked at. So you get me walking or sitting for a long time, you'll see me start rubbing my knee and start extending it, trying to get some momentum into it. And then yesterday we pick up all these things. And again, I did this after class, so I drove down, and it's already like 4:00 to help my friends. Mm-hmm. And we must have put furniture together and lifted stuff until about 5 or 6 in the morning. And we didn't realize it was that late. We were just trying to get as much done as we can because they needed my help. Then I look at the clock, and I'm like, oh, I have class in 4 to 5 hours. And I was like, huh. And so I drove back to my house, let my poor dog out. Me and her got in the bed. I woke up today, went to class, and then came back down and started getting ready for tonight. So really looking forward to tonight. Of course, if you don't know, I don't know if I've ever said it on the show, I'm a great fan of Robert E. Lee. So I've always looked forward to tonight. So without further ado, I guess we will get started. But my phone's on. So if you have anything you want to start with, you can go ahead.
Well, I actually think I spoke for the very first time on SCV Chat a year ago.
Really?
And I was talking about Robert E. Lee. And I was talking, I wrote a book 2 or 3 years ago about a group, the 39th Battalion Virginia Cavalry. They considered themselves Lee's bodyguard. They were a courier battalion. They drove wagons. There were actually 2 members of the battalion that drove Robert E. Lee's personal wagon and his personal ambulance. And I think it was a year ago that I was first on SCV Chat. We would have to double check that. I'm not as good about recent history as I am about things that happened 160 years ago. But I'm looking forward to revisiting the subject of Robert E. Lee this evening. I'm a big Lee fan myself. You can see my stand-up cutout of Robert E. Lee over there looking over my shoulder. You can see my copy of The Last Meeting between Lee and Jackson. And that entire short shelf behind me is nothing but Robert E. Lee books. And I admire Lee a great deal. Now, Lee was not perfect. And I know sometimes I posted something on my own Facebook page today. Some of the posts that I've written on my blog over the years about Robert E. Lee, but Lee was not perfect. You know, the attack at Malvern Hill was not necessarily a good idea by Robert E. Lee. The charge on July 3rd, 1863, not really a good idea. But, you know, I admire Lee greatly. I admire his sense of duty and his just so many things about him, his Christian life, and just so many things that there are to admire about Robert E. Lee. And I really look forward for this evening, for the next few minutes that we get to chat. And thank you so much for dropping me that line. I had migrated upstairs for a few minutes when I got your note, and had to come down and pull my copy of Lee, The Last Years, off the shelf.
I'm in a bad habit of when we do these book reviews. I'll read the book if I have time. Of course, college makes me have to read a lot of nonsense. So by the end of that day, I'm usually kind of, I hate to say it, tired of reading. But, you know, I had a lot more free time this semester. So I read the whole book, and then, you know, today was happening and it was getting close to showtime. And I sat there and I was like, I don't have any notes ready. So I started getting my notes ready, and I have a bit of notes here, a bit of stories to tell, but I'm going to let you do a lot of the talking tonight. I'm going to take a guess you know a bit more about Lee than me, considering you've probably been studying him.
I've studied him for a long time. A lot of the things that I have written, I love regiments and brigades. A lot of the things that I have written have been about soldiers that served under Robert E. Lee. And so there are his letters and reminiscences, that book, and of course Friedman's 4 volumes, that biography, and then Friedman's Lee's Lieutenants are usually my companions as I'm working on things that deal with the Army of Northern Virginia. There are just some fantastic resources out there about Robert E. Lee. He's the most written about Confederate general. You know, there are a lot of great things out there. And the book by Flood, Charles Flood, Lee, The Last Years, was not the first book to cover the last part of Lee's life. There was actually a book that was written and published in 1922 by a professor from Washington and Lee College, or it was Washington and Lee College at that time. That's called Lee After Appomattox, General Robert E. Lee After Appomattox. It was written by Franklin L. Riley, and as I said, published in 1922. Washington Lee University is where he was a professor of history at. Riley was. And I think both books really complement each other. There's a great chapter in Riley's book that talks about what Robert E. Lee checked out from the library at Washington and Lee, because they have his library records. And he was reading he read Shakespeare, he read the history of England, and you know, I being someone who's surrounded by books all the time, I enjoy seeing what other people have written. But Lee, The Last Years, the book we're going to talk about tonight, was written by Charles Flood, who actually lived in Richmond, Kentucky, and passed away in 2014. I think I got to meet him once. I was in Richmond, Kentucky. It's kind of where my wife's people are from, and was at a function, and then this had probably been 25 years ago, and didn't have the book then, or if I did, I didn't have it with me and didn't get him to sign it. But I like Flood's book a lot. It's very succinct. It really covers some good points about those last years, hard years that Robert E. Lee lived after the surrender at Appomattox. Hard years. And so, where do we go from there?
Ooh. Well, first, your instinct was right on. The last time, and I cannot believe it's been this long, you were on the show. I can tell because in the beginning of the video, I have my dog, and she's maybe 10 weeks old in the video. Was January 25th of 2021.
So almost a year ago.
Yes, sir. And let's see here. Oh, this was the second episode you did, though.
Okay.
So this was it. Michael C. Hardy is back to talk about Stonewall Jackson and the Branch Lane Brigade.
Right.
That was a very good episode, if I remember correctly. But I was going to talk a bit about just Lee's connections to his students. That's really all I wanted to focus on. So, and his soldiers. So if you have anything you want to focus on and throw out there first, you can go ahead.
There's a great little piece exchanged on page 53 of the book. If any of our viewers have this, and Lee is back in Richmond, and I think it's on page 53. Lee is back in Richmond, and one day there's a knock at the door, and Lee goes up and he opens the door, and Flood makes this point that Lee never knew when he could be arrested. When this little episode takes place, Jefferson Davis has not been captured yet. Davis is still out someplace in Georgia at this point in time. But Lee has that in his mind that he can be arrested at any time. And so there's a knock at the door, and Lee goes to the door. And when he opens the door, there's one of his old soldiers. And one of the old soldiers, of course, they're not old by that point in time, but one of his soldiers says that he wants Lee, the soldier, wants Lee to go with him because there are a group of soldiers that will take Lee into the mountain passes and protect Lee and guard him to keep him from being arrested. Because you had to know that all of these people thought that, they were probably going to be hanged. It's why Breckinridge left the country, and a lot of the other cabinet officers, that was their intent, were to leave the country. Some of the other generals did as well. And Lee's response was to this soldier wanting him to run away with him. Lee says, "You would not have your general run away and hide. He must stay and meet his fate." And that's a fantastic story that really dives into the character of Robert E. Lee. Lee has resigned his position in the United States Army. He has joined the military forces in Virginia, and then he is eventually commissioned, not long thereafter, commissioned a general in the Confederate forces, and they fought this war to establish their own country. Hard to say, but they've lost. Mm-hmm. And, that's going through everybody's mind on the Confederate side and on the minds of a lot of the radicals. What do we do with all of these former Confederates? Mm-hmm. There's a proposal in William T. Sherman's book, his memoirs, and Sherman writes, going back to Jefferson Davis, they didn't want to capture Jefferson Davis. They wanted Davis to escape. And in Sherman's memoirs, Sherman actually tells this story about one of his staff officers says, "Well, look, we've got a ship in Charleston. Jefferson Davis can just escape. And we don't have to deal with what to do with all of these Southerners after the war is over." Of course, the war is about over at that point in time. And that's of course going through Lee's mind. That's going through that soldier who appeared at Lee's door and knocked and said, "Hey, let's go to the mountains. We can protect you up there, and let's hide out," because that soldier knew that there was a chance that Lee could have been tried and executed for treason. And a lot of naysayers these days bring that up, and I've seen it so many times today on Facebook, and I don't even respond anymore. That Lee was a traitor. And my response back when I used to respond was, "A, you need to go get your copy of the Constitution and read the definition of treason. And then after you've read that definition of treason, go back and get your copy of the Constitution and look up and see what it says about a state leaving the Union." And that usually ends the conversation right there, because there is nothing in the Constitution about a state leaving the Union. If you believe the Constitution, that's something that's relegated to the states themselves to decide. And since Virginia left the Union, or joined a different country, how can Lee guilty? How can Lee be guilty of treason? He's not a part of the United States anymore. But I don't even argue anymore with that. So I have better things to do with my time.
Yeah. I got a lot of it on Robert E. Lee Day this Monday.
Yeah.
I posted the picture and just telling everybody, happy Robert E. Lee Day, and got a couple people commenting on that on Robert E. Lee, and then I, of course, if you comment on my page, my SCV page, for sure, I was going to talk to you about it. And me and this person talked about it, and then I had a couple other comments on another post I made today. But yeah, some of these people, I hate to say it, but they're not in it. They don't want to learn. They're not open-minded to it. So at that point, I mean, I'm not saying you're wasting your breath, because there's always someone that could walk by and see it and be like, "Well, I didn't know it. Constitution said you couldn't succeed," or, "I fully thought he was a traitor. Let me look into this more." I always try to be an optimistic on that angle, because I always think there's a chance for everybody to learn. And so I always try to go above and beyond and try to answer the questions to the best of my ability.
And if you shoot me a question, I will do that as well. But I'm just not going to jump into other people's conversations anymore. I told somebody that the other day, and they said, "Why don't you get out there more?" It's like, look, I have my email runneth over with people that are looking for help. And so I'm going to concentrate on those people. I had somebody from Knoxville shoot me a message, I think from Knoxville, a half hour ago or an hour ago, looking for somebody, a Confederate soldier stationed in Asheville. And so I'm going to concentrate on helping those folks. Of course, Lee was indicted for treason. And if you've read Flood's book, you know that U.S. Grant actually wrote a letter to the President of the United States, who by that point in time is Andrew Johnson, and regret to say a North Carolinian, but and said, General Grant writes to Andrew Johnson and says, these charges need to be dropped. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but these charges need to be dropped, and Lee needs to have his citizenship restored. And the charges were not necessarily dropped, but they stopped pursuing them at that point in time. Of course, as we know, Jefferson Davis is in prison at this point in time, and he would be in prison down at Fortress Monroe for 2 years. And they could never make that charge of treason stick. And a lot of folks bat that around as well, that, of course, Davis would have been tried in federal court in Richmond, where the offense took place. And they couldn't get enough people to be on a jury. Well, there are so many carpetbaggers in Richmond by that point in time, I seriously doubt they would have had any trouble sitting a jury to try Jefferson Davis for treason. And there are a lot of radicals that wanted that. So the indictment against Lee, and Flood talks about this as well, is kind of swept under the rug. But Lee does not get his citizenship back ever, or at least in his lifetime, he does not get it back. It is not until 1975 that a librarian finds that petition that Lee wrote. And the way that it worked, I don't know if a lot of folks were familiar with this, but if I was a Confederate soldier and I had been surrendered or paroled, I would have to write my governor, and the governor would have to forward my petition for a presidential pardon. And there's if I'd have been a general, I would have had to done that. If I'd have been a politician, I had to do that. If I had worked for the Confederate government carrying the mail, I had to get a presidential pardon. And Robert E. Lee, of course, being eventually the commander-in-chief of all Confederate armies, that didn't happen until the last days of the war, but being a very high-ranking Confederate general, he had to personally write his governor, and his governor would have forwarded that to Andrew Johnson. And Lee never got, during his lifetime, was never pardoned during his lifetime. And it was not until 1975 that was discovered, and a joint congressional delegation actually passed a resolution, and President Ford signed that on August 5th, 1975, giving Lee his citizenship back. That would never happen today, but that did happen. I was trying to figure out 45 years ago, that Lee got his citizenship back. Of course, he'd been dead for a long time by that point in time.
It's hard to believe that it took that long for that to happen. And yeah, and it's hard to believe also how close that is now. I mean, 45, 46 years ago.
Yes. Makes me wonder, though. I don't have an answer for this question. Maybe some of our viewers have that. How many other Confederate generals and politicians never got their pardon? I don't have an answer for that question. There are 425 Confederate generals, and I actually don't know how many Confederate politicians. That would include governors, and that would include your folks in the Confederate House and the Confederate Senate. So if anybody's looking for a research project, I probably will not get to that one in my lifetime, but maybe somebody's already looked into it. Sometimes I'm surprised. David Pope says Jubal Early never asked, and there are other Confederate generals that never asked. And that's there are folks who never asked. There are folks who never came back to the States. There are Judah P. Benjamin never came back to the States after he escaped during Jefferson Davis's flight south. And of course, there's the group of Confederates that went to Brazil. There are Confederates that went to Egypt. There are Confederates who went to Mexico. So these folks, there's a great book out there called Generals at Rest, that gentleman and his son, I don't remember the author right offhand, but they actually took years trying to track down and photograph the grave of every Confederate general out there, and found the vast majority. I mean, there are only a handful that they did not find.
Not imagine taking that task up.
Yes. Now, some folks, and you can get this out of Flood's book as well, there were some Confederates at that point in time. And I saw Christopher Rice kind of says this: many soldiers did not ask for pardons because they didn't feel like they'd done anything wrong. There were some folks that were against Lee asking for that pardon. And that's up to an individual person whether they ask for that pardon or not. And it's hard for us to read into individual people's lives. Some of them were very embittered over the experiences they had, and other ones just wanted to get on with their lives. There were certain jobs that you had to have your citizenship to do. Zebulon Baird Vance, who was Colonel of the 26th North Carolina and then Governor of North Carolina, took years to get his pardon back. Well, Vance, before the war, was in the U.S. House, and he was a lawyer. He hated being a lawyer. He really detested the whole law thing. He wanted to be a politician. And he did eventually get his citizenship right back. But until he got that, he could not serve in the U.S. Congress. And there were former Confederates that were elected to Congress that the U.S. Congress refused to seat because of their former Confederate allegiance and their involvement in the Confederate military or in the Confederate government. Casey asked about James Kemper. Was he would he have to have a pardon to be governor after the war? Yes, he would have had to have a presidential pardon. And there were blanket pardons. Andrew Johnson passed a blanket pardon. You know, if you were a Confederate soldier and a private in the ranks like my kinfolk from Alabama or Tennessee or someplace, then you didn't have to have a presidential pardon. You were, hate to use the word, but the U.S. government, if you were a low-ranking individual, pretty much just, quote, absolved you of your sins. I know that's distasteful, but and said, okay, you can get on with your lives. It's those high-ranking folks, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, any of the 425 Confederate generals, any of the Confederate governors, any of the House or Senate members. You had, if you had, I think it was, don't quote me on this, I think it's, if 1860 your personal wealth was more than $20,000, I think that was the figure. If you were a departmental commander, any of those things, then you had to have a special presidential pardon. And another interesting idea, some governors were good about forwarding those pardons, but other governors were not. W.W. Holden here in North Carolina, when Jonathan Worth took his job as governor, Worth found all of these pardons in the back of a file cabinet that Holden had just sat on. And that may be true in other states as well. I write a lot about North Carolina, so I'm more familiar with that story. But, you know, I don't, of course, I think the South was right. And so many other things I could say about that, but we're supposed to be talking about Lee. I think many of these people were just trying to get on with their lives. And so that's the whole idea of the pardon, you know.
Well, yeah, and it's not like Lee took offense, or not took offense, but it's not like Lee regretted his time in the Confederate Army. I think he said to a former soldier that went into his office after he was put as president of Washington College that he wanted to get the years back that he had from the Army. And again, I'm going to paraphrase because I thought I had the quote written down because I loved it today when I was going back and trying to find some notes, but I don't have it in here. But he talked about that being one of the most honorable years of his life, and like he was not going to top that as one of the great things he does in his life. And that showed to me right then and there, Lee still took pride in the fact that he served. He took pride in the cause that he fought for. It's just, again, he wanted the best for the South. And I think he was just trying to help start rebuild the South, really, because it was destroyed after the war. And I think Lee even says that through education that I think it was Beauregard that sent General Lee a letter asking for his opinion on what to do, either to I believe leave the U.S. or stay in the U.S. And Lee said that the South now more than ever needed its sons,
Right.
and needed its people to stand up and help rebuild it. And I think Lee said he's not going. But he, again, paraphrasing, Lee basically said, "I'm not going to leave. I'm here to do my part. That's why I'm at the college. I'm doing my part to try to rebuild the South." And I think he added a lot of programs like that for Washington Lee. He added some engineering programs, if I'm not mistaken, along with some other things. I think that Washington College was the only college not the only, but one of the very few colleges that had a Spanish a program at the time and stuff like that. Lee was just trying to teach the young men of the South, of course, how to be gentlemen and how to go out and rebuild the South land, because it was just completely destroyed after the war. And I have one line from the book here. I think it's over. Let's see here. Well, I can paraphrase. I know it. But a lot of people in the South, when Lee first went to the college, a lot of people were more concerned about what they were going to eat and how are they going to live life than education at the time. And the University of Alabama reopened after the war and had one student.
Mm-hmm.
And that just shows you the dire stress that the South was in at the time. Not many had much to pay for college. And so they weren't focusing on that. They were just focusing on surviving the aftermath of the war at the time.
And I think that's something that often gets lost in that conversation. We think, and as a writer, it's easy to just end the war when Lee surrenders at Appomattox in April of 1865, and the war goes on. It really does. Of course, you have the surrender of Joe Johnston in the Army of Tennessee. You've got the surrender of E. Kirby Smith. You've got Jefferson Davis. Who knows where he's really trying to go, but, he eventually gets captured May 10th, 1865 in Georgia. And I feel
like I can relate to Jefferson Davis there. As again, I'm always told I'm a hopeless optimistic when it comes to things in trying to put up the cause and protect the Confederate soldiers' good name. I take the charge very seriously in the SCV, and some people tell me when I'm reaching out to people that just slam me down immediately, just cut me off, like, talking to a brick wall type thing, that I'm a hopeless optimistic. I think at that point, that was I relate to Jefferson Davis being like, no, I still have hope.
And Davis did, and he said that over and over and over again. His plan when he left Charlotte that last week of April, I think it's April 26th of 1865, is he plans to go link up with E. Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi Department and continue the war. That's his whole purpose at that point in time. Now, and I realize we're off topic, but, he kind of gets down there and kind of gets wrapped up with his family, with Verena and the children, and that kind of slows him down a little bit, and he eventually gets surrounded and captured. But that's, Davis, there's a lot of people who hated Davis toward the end of the war and after the end of the war. A lot of Southerners who don't like Davis. But of all people, he still had hope. He still had faith in the Confederate cause. And that's evident that whole 3 weeks he spent in North Carolina, going from Greensboro to Charlotte and having those meetings with his Confederate cabinet in Charlotte. Of all the people there, he's the person who still believes that there is hope. And I don't know. Lee's a more harder person to study, to grasp when it comes to those last 4 or 5 years of his life. Of course, Lee never writes his memoirs. We have Davis and the Rise and Fall of the Confederate government. Lee talks about it, and he petitions some of his former officers for letters and notes because he's toying with the idea of writing something, but he never does. And he gives a couple of interviews, and that's it. We don't get that from Lee. There was a conversation the other day, of all the people, who do you wish had left a memoir or something? And Lee comes to the top of a lot of people's list. Now, some people say, given what Lee had written as an introduction to that biography of his dad, that it would have been dry as dirt, whatever Lee would have written, based upon what Lee had already written. But I would have loved to have seen.
I would have loved it, yeah.
Lee's take on things, of course, Lee, the war broke Lee financially. They lost Arlington, his son, one of his son's plantation house, the one there at Whitehall, had been burned by the Federals. And there's no way that Lee could have been the quote gentleman farmer. Lee had to make a living. He didn't get a pension from the U.S. Army. And so Lee didn't have the time because he was so busy rebuilding his little section of the South. And that little section is Washington College. And, the students that he had are important. I would love, and this may be out there, and it may even be in the book. I'm not sure. I would love to know how many of his students are former soldiers, because a lot of them in that last year of the war were kids. But that's what he's doing. Is he is not only telling other people to rebuild the South, he's doing that. And that's one thing that we all need to learn is, we need to be doing that in our own little ways. I personally cannot go out and save the entire South. That's just not going to happen. Yeah. And, Harrison, you can't go out and save the entire South. That's not going to happen. But if you and I and the other people, David Pope and John and Jason and all of these folks, if we reach that little group that we're around and have an influence about, then we are carrying out what Robert E. Lee wanted us to do, even 150 years after the event.
Yeah, and I have here, of course, when Lee came back, I mentioned earlier that, and this, of course, attests to, again, Robert E. Lee's popularity. And, of course, how he did what he did to rebuild the South. And, again, we all know that famous Robert E. Lee quote about duty. And he took that very seriously. And he dedicated his last years of life to do something that he knew that put stress on his body, and because he didn't like the public spotlight. He learned that very quickly in Richland, that he did not like that. And when he moved to that, I can't remember exactly the name of it right now. It's Oak. That little house that a woman let them stay in, and he left there in the country. And I think he said that was the first time he really truly felt peace, because bless his heart, he didn't have so many people coming up to him. And, he felt, we talked about this Monday, the burden of being Robert E. Lee.
Right.
And because he was a man of honor, and he took everything like that seriously. And he took being Robert E. Lee seriously. And, he was very careful after the war to make sure he helped the South in any way he could to heal. He made sure not to try to stab open an old wound. And that's talked about in the book, that Robert E. Lee tried his best to help the South heal and recover from the war. But yeah, he got Washington College up to 150 students. And I remember reading in that chapter where it tells us that a lot of the students were former soldiers that first year. And I don't think it gives an exact number. And if it does, I don't remember it. But I do know that a lot of former students were in there because instead of calling him President Lee or Mr. Lee, the name became just, of course, General. Yeah. And they didn't even serve under him in the war or never served a day in their life would call him General.
Right.
And so I know that happened. And then I know on the first topic of chapter, I think 1, it talks about how a lot of these people joined the war when they were 16 and they were ending the war around 20 and they hadn't been paid in a year. And, you know, at that time, you know, 20 is, you know, much to my body's dismay, is still young. Mm-hmm. And they probably, a lot of them did go and join that college. And a lot of people, of course, the college served a couple students during the war that were too young. And I think the book even says Lee was almost like he was a little bit, I would say a little bit more gentle with them, I think it said. He was very, very friendly to younger men and trying to help them in this world. And the people who he served or served under him, I think, I wouldn't say he was harsher on them, but I think he thought they knew their way a little bit better and tried to help them find that. I think you can go ahead.
No, go ahead. Keep going.
I think even in the book, it talks about how when Lee was in the Army, he used his position of power to help people. And he did the same thing in the role as president of a college. And I think one kid came in and he was chewing tobacco, and Lee just took off his reading glasses and just said he doesn't like chewing tobacco. He finds it not annoying, but I'm paraphrasing, so I'm going to say annoying. And he told the kid to go out in the hall and spit it out. Kid goes in the hall, but he comes back chewing the tobacco. Lee, not saying a word, puts his glasses back on, writes the letter, and hands it to the kid and asks him to read it out loud. Kid reads it out loud, and it says his name, and then it says, is hereby dismissed for dishonoring the president of this college. Mm-hmm. And Lee looked at him and said, that will be outside, posted on the bulletin board in 10 minutes. The weight of that, disrespecting General Robert E. Lee in the South, that poor kid would have just been looked. He knew the consequence of that simple sentence. So-and-so has been dismissed from the college because of his disrespect to the president. He knew what that meant. And then in another story, a kid whose father was in the Confederacy, but his mother was from actually New York. And so all the other kids called him Yankee. And he went to General Lee and he talked to him about it. And General Lee basically said, you tell them that next time they call you Yankee, they can come see and talk to me. And then I think as soon as the kid told them that, no one ever called him Yankee again. General Robert E. Lee knew his position. He knew the weight of being Robert E. Lee it had on him, but he also knew how it could help others. And he knew how to use that to help these young Southern gentlemen become gentlemen. He showed them how to act like a gentleman. Then he showed them how to help the South in their own way via their education, what they went into, what they could do for the South. And I think even in the book it says, and again, early chapters I focus on a good bit. I took a lot of tabs on that first couple of chapters. Robert E. Lee, more than any man, tried to help heal the wounds of this war more than anybody.
Right.
And I completely agree. He tried. He spent those last years, pun intended, of his life trying to heal the South and make its children, the children of his soldiers, or just his soldiers in general because they were so young, that next generation. He tried his best to teach them. and he tried his best to show them how to act and send them out into the South to be productive members of society.
One of the things, the stories I remember from the book, is a young student being called into Lee's office for some minor infraction, and the student being absolutely terrified to have to go to Robert E. Lee's office and face Robert E. Lee. And Lee, of course, was very nice and very cordial, even though Robert E. Lee is known for having a temper. He did have an extremely violent temper, but he often kept it under check. But that student having, and the kid was probably 14 or 15 years old, 16 years old. College students were a lot younger back then, but having to go into Lee's office because you'd committed some minor infraction, and sit down and talked with Lee. There was a comment up here from Sandra, and asked about top recommended books on Robert E. Lee.
Let me pull it up real quick.
Go back up. It was at 9:17. And I'm a big book guy. Many of y'all know that. I live on the side of a mountain in western North Carolina and don't have access to a good library. And so I just buy books and have my own good library in here. The book that we're talking about tonight, Charles B. Flood's Lee, The Last Year, is a fantastic book about Robert E. Lee and the last part of his life. I am a big fan of Douglas Southall Freeman's 4 volumes on Lee. It actually won the Pulitzer when it came out in the 1930s. Freeman was of a generation that could write. And when I was young, first getting interested in the war in that time period, my parents would take me to the library, and I checked out a lot of books from the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s. And those folks could write. They could tell what history is. History is a story. And I read Freeman, and I read Burke Davis and Clifford Doughty, and I even read Bruce Catton, who wrote about the Federal Army. But Catton could write, just put words together beautifully. So Freeman's 4 volumes on Lee, I really like. Flood's Lee, The Last Years, I really like. There's a couple of books that look at Lee's early life, Lee in the Shadow of Washington. And then I mentioned in a comment on, if you really like a lot of detail, Charlie Knight's new book on, it's called From Arlington to Appomattox. It is a day-by-day look at Robert E. Lee's life during the war. And Charlie did a phenomenal job with that book. But it's not a reader. You're not going to sit down like you are with Charles Flood, even though I did sit down and read Charlie Knight's book on Lee. It's not a reader like this. So those are some of my favorites. There are a couple of other books. I was not a fan of Pryor's book on Lee. And there's some others out there that, even though I'm not that big of a fan of. Too many writers and historians today really let their bias show through when they're writing. And all writers have a bias. We all have a bias. Okay. Don't ever think that writers don't have a bias, because we all have a bias. But so many times those biases are so blatantly obvious. Historians come up with an idea, and then we go cherry pick resources to back up our idea, ignoring a whole bunch of stuff out there that may, not back up our idea. We only pick the things that back up our idea. That's some of my favorites. There are a lot of other books on Lee. Sanborn's 2-volume biography is not bad. Margaret Sanborn. Um, Clifford Dowdy's book on Lee is pretty good. Not a big fan of Emery Thomas's book on Lee, but there are a lot of books on Lee out there. So I wish I could say I had read them all, but I have not.
She said that she didn't catch the last book you recommended. What was it?
I'm going to turn around and get it off the shelf, so bear with me. It's by Richard McCausland. It's called Lee in the Shadow of Washington. So I kind of like that book as well. Just remember, when you read somebody's book, it's their opinion or their bias. I had a great discussion with somebody the other day on one of the Facebook forums who, got up there and said that he absolutely, when he taught classes, and he said every class he teaches, he sees it as their job to bust Southern myths. And I responded back and said, every class I ever teach, I said that remember that 99% of everything you see is somebody's opinion. And they didn't like that very well. I broke my own rule and got into a discussion. But that's an important thing to remember. Even the people that write in that time period were getting their opinion about what happened. When Taylor, who was one of Lee's staff officers, writes about Lee, we're getting Taylor's opinion, even though Taylor was there. He was with Lee. Walter Taylor was there. He was with Lee. Wrote 2 pretty interesting books. One of them is a history of the Army of Northern Virginia that's kind of dry. But his book about Lee, his experiences as a staff officer is a pretty good read. Even though Taylor can be critical of Lee at sometimes. And Lee is not, and I said this today and got somebody riled up a little bit, that, Lee was not always right. I think I've already said that this evening. Malvern Hill was not a good move. July 3rd, 1863 is not the best move that Lee could have made. We can sit back 150, 60 years later and say, well, Lee should have done this. He should have done that. But he didn't. Had I been Robert E. Lee on July 3rd, I would have pulled back. I would have guarded those mountain passes, forcing the federal army to go do something someplace, and continued to let my army pick the countryside clean. But that's not what Robert E. Lee did. So sorry. Lee ordered that charge on July 3rd. He ordered the cavalry back in the rear, and it didn't work out very well.
Yeah, and I would say if you would have talked to me while I was blessed to be very well educated for my age when I was younger, and before college got their holds on me, and I think actually make me forget a lot of my my early studies. I've had to go back and reread stuff I used to be able to tell you off the top of my head. But again, I'm a big Lee fan, so I would say back in middle school, maybe even early high school, if you would have told me that, man, I know I would have gotten hot under the collar, because I find so much respect in Lee, and I've bought so many books on Wisdom by Robert E. Lee, or Leadership Skills by Robert E. Lee, or stuff like that, because growing up in the South, we all look up to him,
right?
And he is a great hero, a great man, a great Southern gentleman. But we all need to remember, and it's a lesson I learned a bit later in life. I say later in life, acting like I'm 85 on the cusp of being called back home, not like I'm 22, but when I say it, I mean probably towards middle of high school. It come to realization that he was a great man, but there's that word, he was a great man. And we all know we are flawed, and the only perfect person that has walked the graces of this earth was Jesus.
That's right.
And so Robert E. Lee did make mistakes. And it was important how he responded to those.
Exactly.
And earlier I was going to talk a bit on Lee's connection with the soldiers, but I think we all know he had a great connection to the soldiers, and he felt those casualties. And so for me to know that after that fateful day when he did give that charge in July,
Mm-hmm.
I know as soon as it had to end, that hurt him.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
again,
Lee tried to resign after that.
really, I actually did not know that.
Yes, he actually submitted a letter of resignation after the Gettysburg campaign, and Jefferson Davis refused to accept it. Lee, and I don't remember the exact wording of the letter, but said that a younger man, a man that was in better health, needed to take command of the Army. And it's been mentioned several times in the comments this evening about Lee's health problems, possibly having a heart attack around Fredericksburg, heart problems during the Gettysburg campaign. He had a case of the Tennessee Quick Step during the Battle of Gettysburg itself. And of course, during part of the Overland campaign, he was confined to his tent. And he did have health problems, and Lee did try to resign once, and Davis refused his resignation.
I'm shocked to say I've never heard that he tried to resign before. So thank you for that information, and it makes a lot of sense. As I said, Lee knew he wasn't perfect, and we just have to remember that as people in general. Just because he was a great person and a great leader, in my opinion, doesn't mean he was perfect. And he did make mistakes, and a lot of people do point to Gettysburg. I know personally I do. But if I was in his shoes, I don't know what I would have done. And I can't act like I would do it any better. So, yeah, take it with a grain of salt, but we have to know we're all human.
Yep.
Someone asked Tennessee quick step question
Yes.
mark.
You remember in the movie Gettysburg that Walter Taylor is offering that mountain of flapjacks and ham and butter and all that? Well, something right before the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee had eaten and it made him sick. And there were a couple of reports from different officers, one from a general, of Lee having to make several trips out behind his tent one evening because he had a case of the Tennessee Quick Step. Surely, David, you have heard of the Tennessee Quick Step.
I'm hoping that answers the question, because at first, I thought you just were meaning he was a bit sick and stuff. When you just explained it now, I was like, oh, okay, yeah.
Yep.
Bless his heart.
Vincent, I can't say it was that bad, but he was having problems. And that was actually, to digress just a little bit, and I wrote a blog post about this. There were a lot of Confederate generals who had health issues like that during the war, because the food at times, many times, was substandard. There's a story about Lawrence O'Brien Branch. He'd had dysentery for 6 or 8 weeks, and he is actually being hauled in a wagon as the Army goes to fight, as Jackson goes to fight at Cedar Mountain. And literally right before the battle, he crawls out of the wagon. Literally right before Branch's brigade, his brigade steps off to go fight, he crawls out of the wagon to take command. And that was probably a pretty common occurrence. Maybe more so than we actually think, but yeah. They were ill quite often because of bad food. Plug, I actually have a whole book coming out on that subject sometime later this year called Feeding the Army of Northern Virginia. So hopefully it'll be this year. COVID's kind of messed that up, but that's okay. Yeah.
Someone talked about the stress that Lee had on his body. You can tell from a picture in that can't be right. Okay, never mind. I'm sorry, I misread that comment. But you can tell from pictures how the war and there's the stress, of course, of being Robert E. Lee, and he knew what that meant to people. Took on his mind, body, and spirit, and you could tell. I completely agree with that. He knew his health wasn't the greatest as well. He knew he had heart problems. I don't think he knew how severe they were though. And there's not really much way he could know.
Right.
But I mean, yeah, the stress of being Robert E. Lee and of course the war and being a leader took a toll on him. And I think you could even say that even adds to his character. If being a good person and you're over stressing about it and you're over stressing that you're making the right choices for other people so they come out better, not you. He legit, when he took the Washington College presidency, he was putting his health over others. I mean, he was putting, people's benefit over his health because he knew that this would throw him right back into the stressful lifestyle that he had just left behind. And it did. And of course, the way to being Robert E. Lee, he wanted to be a farmer. And bless his heart, I don't know what it is about this country and our great men that we just won't let them be farmers. And we call them back to do something.
Yeah.
But we have a good history of that. But
started with George Washington.
That's what I was referring to. I'm also a big George Washington guy. Of course, father of our country. I studied him as probably the only person I probably would say I've studied more is Robert E. Lee.
Right.
So, yes, that was the nice. I'm glad you got that. I was scared that no one was going to get that. But, yeah, our country has a great history of after our leaders have contributed legit all they could, and they want to go out and have a normal life, we ask, could you give us a bit more, and we bring them back in.
All right.
And Robert E. Lee gave all he had to defend the cause, and then he gave it all over again to rebuild and teach the next generation of Southern gentlemen. And golly, I can't exactly remember the quote about duty, but he lived that. And that inspires me to go out and try my best to represent the Confederate soldiers' good name. That's why I want to be a teacher, to teach and help the future generation kids and show people that these men were good men. They weren't the evil people that you're told about. And I feel a calling towards that. I'm not going to put myself on Lee's level. Do not think I'm over here doing this. Far from it. I just want to help along. As you said earlier, I can't save the South. You can't save the South. We all have to tune in to help. It's a team effort.
It takes all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So I was scrolling through, looking at the comments. Dennis actually put up parts of Lee's resignation letter. He wrote to President Davis. Lee wrote to President Davis, I have been prompted by these reflections more than once since my return from Pennsylvania to propose to Your Excellency the propriety of selecting another commander for this army. No one is more aware than myself of my inability for the duties of my position. I cannot even accomplish what I desire. I, therefore, in all sincerity, request Your Excellency to take measures to supply my place. So, Lee knows he doesn't feel well. He knows Gettysburg's not really gone quite to plan. And we could talk sometime about Gettysburg and about how it is not the crushing defeat that the media makes it out to be, that modern writers make it out to be. But
I think, just a quick question of my own. I would put Vicksburg up there.
Oh, Vicksburg's from Fort Donelson and Fort Henry down to Vicksburg. I mean, and I've written about this too. Winfield Scott's the person who won the war. And everybody's scratching their head going, who the heck is Winfield Scott? Winfield Scott was the commander-in-chief of the United States Army, and he develops this plan very early on called the Anaconda Plan, where his layout of the war is to strangle the South by blockading and closing down all of the ports, then capturing the Mississippi River, then sending the federal armies in. Well, the South doesn't have a lot of resources industrial-wise, and it's eventually Winfield Scott's plan that wins the war, even though Scott's dead. He resigns and dies during the war. But it's the loss of the Mississippi River that is more important than, and it's the loss of the state of Tennessee that is more important than Gettysburg. But we can come back and talk about that at some other time.
Oh yeah, and I think we've talked about. I think we've done a good episode tonight. I hope y'all have enjoyed it. I guess for a book review, because considering I've never hosted a book review, I guess this went well. I just enjoyed talking about Robert E. Lee with Michael and everybody else in the chat. So, I mean, I've had a great time. I hope y'all have. I guess for an official review, I would say read the book.
Right.
I would say it's definitely worth a read. I love it. I read it. I would say every couple months, either because I've left one of my books at the house, and I always have this book near me, and so I'll just pick it up and read it. I read it 4 times during COVID, which means I should really remember more of the information better than paraphrasing like I did tonight. But my memory is not the greatest. But I would
think
say
I did okay for, it's been a couple of years since I've read that one. So
I was about to say you did better than me, and I read the book this weekend. So bravo, sir, bravo. But again, I would recommend you buy the book. I guess if that's the style of a review, I would definitely recommend it. I enjoyed it. I loved it. And I think it has a lot of good information in it that we all need to hear. So without further ado, I guess it's time to end the show. Please remember about Look Around the Confederation tomorrow. Confederate Standard Time, same Confederate channel, same Confederate time. Well, no, not the same as tonight. It's 7. We go back to our normal time tomorrow. I extended this a bit so I could get my notes together and everything. But if you have whatever you did for Lee Jackson Day, celebrating it, whether in Lexington, because I know that got a lot of attention, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow. And you were like me in Mississippi, and I went out to just pay respects at a Confederate cemetery and a monument. And I explained a bit of Confederate history and the importance of monument, these memorials to a group of kids and their parents. And I took a couple pictures for people by the monument. That's how I celebrated. Whatever you did, please send these pictures to scvyouth@gmail.com. And we will be giving Lee Jackson Day the coverage that the news media should have given it. It did not. Shocker. We got a lot of negative press that day, so we're going to turn it around, take the narrative back from them, and we're going to be talking about that tomorrow. I do not think I have any more news. Yeah, I do. And then on the second part of tomorrow's show, we will have the camp putting up the replica of the Lee Monument taken down in Virginia, coming on to talk about the progress they've made and everything else under the sun with that. So I guess without further ado, thank you, Mr. Michael Hardy, for coming on. It's been a great show. I think from what I've been seeing in the comments, everybody enjoyed it. So that's always great to see. Do you have anything you want to tell everybody before you go?
No, sir. Thank you very much for allowing me to come on. It was great.
Oh, yes, sir. you do have a show on Sundays.
Sunday nights, my channel. It's called Sunday Night History Chat, and I got a blog called Looking for the Confederate War.
All right, perfect. Please go support him on Sundays. Great program. I've been able to catch it a couple times. Sadly, college, because they want us to suffer here at Ole Miss, keeps me doing usually something on Sunday night, whether it be a history paper, and those things have gotten much longer as I've gotten older. So I usually can't tune in, but I've tuned in a good couple times. I watched the previous episode not too long ago. I really enjoyed it. So yes, please go support him. And without further ado, I will see you guys tomorrow. No Fumar in the elevator, ref rock, and I will see you guys next time. Good night.